Good evening. For those of you that may not know me, I am Greg Whitcup, Director of Cranbrook Art Museum and the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. On behalf of my many colleagues here at Cranbrook, including our President, Dom DeMarco, and the Director of Cranbrook Academy of Art, Chris Scotes, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to Cranbrook. Harry Bertoia's career is the very definition of the modern Renaissance man, a person who has wide interests and is expert in several areas. As a sculptor working almost exclusively in metal, he created both monumental architectural installations, including the screens he made for the corporate interiors of buildings, as well as smaller freestanding sculptures that accented the domestic interiors of modern homes across the nation. As a designer, the collection of welded metal diamond chairs that he created for his Cranbrook friend, Florence Knoll, remain to this day icons of 20th century furniture design. As a painter and printmaker, not only did he explore forms that he would later realize in his three-dimensional work, but he created bold and imaginative compositions that extended the developing language of biomorphic abstraction in the decade before World War II. As a musician, he created and played ambient sculptures that continue to mesmerize audiences with their swaying movements and magical sounds. But Bertoia's interests also included jewelry, the production of which began when he was in Michigan, first as a student at Detroit's legendary Cass Tech High School, and later as a student and then instructor here at Cranbrook Academy of Art. While Bertoia's contributions to the field of furniture design are widely celebrated and monographs have been written on both his work as a sculptor and printmaker, very little scholarship has been devoted to his work as a jeweler. In celebration of the centennial this year of the artist's birth, March 10th, just 3 days ago to be precise, we are proud to present Bent, Cast, and Forged, the Jewelry of Harry Bertoia, the first museum exhibition and publication devoted to the artist's jewelry. Hold on. Before I introduce our guest speaker this evening, I would like to thank a few of the people that are integral to our celebration of Bertoia's work this evening. Leading the way on this research and exhibition project has been Shelley Salem, Cranbrook Art Museum's Jean and Ralph Graham Collections Fellow. Shelley's own interests and areas of expertise, like Bertoia's, are wide-ranging, but her work at Cranbrook has focused on the history of 20th century design. In Bent, Cast, and Forged, her second major exhibition project here at Cranbrook, she has again demonstrated her creativity, acuity, and tenacity as a curator, placing the 3 pieces of Bertoia's jewelry in our own collection, just 3, within the context of a remarkable constellation of 27 loans. Of course, these loans would not have been possible without the generosity of a group of committed institutions and individuals from across the continent. In addition to our colleagues at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, Shelley and I both would like to thank the collectors that have joined us this evening, including Kim and Al Iber from Miami, William Drucker from New York, and Renee Murphy, Harry Bertoia's grandniece, who, like her mother, Alida Bertoia, and Aunt Marie Griffith, Harry's nieces, live here in Michigan. We thank you for sharing these precious treasures that I know give you great pleasure on a daily basis. I also want to thank the sponsors of the exhibition and catalog, Richard Wright of the Richard Wright Auction House in Chicago, Kim and Al Iber, and our good friends David Klein and Kate Ostrov, whose endowed exhibition fund supports one of our exhibitions each and every year. The catalog, of course, is available for purchase at the front desk of the Art Museum, and it is rumored that our guest speaker this evening just might be willing to autograph copies during the reception. I also want to give a very loud shout out to Mark Baker, our head preparator and exhibition designer, who, along with his assistant preparator, John Geiger, and work study students, has once again performed magic with his design of the exhibition. Finally, I want to thank Jean Graham. Through the endowment that she had established with her late husband, Ralph Graham, Jean has made it possible for us not only to educate the public through our research and exhibitions, but also to provide a curatorial platform for young professionals like Shelley Salem. It is a gift that benefits all of us. Thank you so very much, Jean. While few, if any of us in the audience tonight had the opportunity to meet Harry Bertoia, and if you did, I want you to come up to me afterwards, we are honored to have with us this evening Celia Bertoia, the daughter of Harry and Brigitta Valentiner Bertoia. And if Brigitta's maiden name, Valentiner, sounds familiar, it is because her father, Celia's grandfather, was the late great director of the DIA, William Valentiner, who invited Diego Rivera to Detroit in 1932 to paint the Detroit industry murals. There's always a Cranbrook connection. Celia Bertoia serves as the director of the Harry Bertoia Foundation and is the author of The Life and Work of Harry Bertoia, which will be released by Schiffer Publications at the end of this month. Please join me in welcoming back to Cranbrook, Celia Bertoia.
Thank you for coming. I'm so excited to be here. And they really have done a fantastic job with the exhibition, that you can see the jewelry from all sides. And it's one thing to see the photographs, but to see them in person is just stunning. So thank you, Cranbrook, and thank you to all of you. What I'd like to do tonight is, of course, tell you some of the facts and the details and the techniques behind Harry Bertoia's work. But I would also like to give you a peek into the man, the father. Who was Harry as a human being? Because he really was a very fine human being. And I think it was only because he was such a fine person that he ended up being an incredibly fine artist. And just a couple of details that I'll cover now before I get carried away with stories. Up on the table, up at the top there, you'll see a few of the items that the foundation has for sale. We've actually done a few reproductions. This is one. We have a pendant, a ring, and a brooch. And you can take a look at the samples, and we also have the Sonambient albums that Harry created just before he died. He put out 11 Sonambient albums of his sounding sculptures. We're reissuing those in honor of the centennial, and they'll be coming out in a CD box set in a few months. You can grab a brochure on those. And also in honor of the centennial, we reproduced a small table-size tonal sculpture. It's just a gem, and it's way cheaper than what you'll find at auction. So you can look at all those things, and my book flyer's up there too. And I'll be here afterwards, so you can ask me any questions you want. But, okay, Harry Bertoia. I may walk around, so... Can you hear me here okay? Yes. All right, good. I can't stand in one spot. That's better. Well, Arietto was his nickname, and Brigitta often called him Arietto. It means simply Little Harry in Italian. He was born in Italy in 1915, and as Greg mentioned, this is the centennial, just a few days ago. And he was born as Harry Bertoia, with a Y, and people called him Arieto. And he only went to school for about 4 or 5 years. That's just all they did in those days. But even as a youngster, he already had a lot of artistic talent. He loved to draw. And his sister, Ave, would complain that she had to do all the chores, and yeah, maybe Harry would help out a little bit, but then he'd run off and hide somewhere and start drawing. But it was an agricultural village in Italy, and there was a drought. It was hard times in Italy. So there came a point where there was a big choice. His parents luckily realized he had artistic talent. In fact, he used to, for the brides in the small village of San Lorenzo, on their wedding night, it was traditional to have a special design embroidered on their wedding linens. And they noticed that Harry was so good at art, so they would ask him to do these designs, so he was doing that. I'm told that he copied a whole deck of cards, and that it was just impeccable. You really couldn't tell the difference. In fact, someone just was telling me earlier today a story I didn't know, that he used to draw the tickets to the movies and get in for free. But at age 15, the choice was, okay, well, we could send him to the Biennale in Venice, which was very expensive, and they really couldn't afford. And the other option was to come to the United States. So, indeed, he came to Detroit, where his brother Oreste was already established. He'd been here for about 5 years. He was working at the Ford factory, and two of his daughters are here tonight. And Oreste was also a very talented man. He was more musically inclined. In fact, he wrote a whole symphony, which was performed at his memorial service, which is quite touching. But Oreste basically sacrificed his own talents to support Harry. He encouraged Harry to get an education, to pursue his talents. And in life, sometimes we have guardian angels who help us along the way. And Harry certainly had his share of them. I mean, he was a very hard worker, had an incredible work ethic, but he did have a number of synchronistic helpers, and his brother Oreste was one of them. So this was when he first came over here. He had to learn the language. He didn't speak a word of English. He went to Americanization school. He went to the Cleveland Public Elementary School, and he was already a teenager, but he had to catch up. Then he went to Cass Technical High School, and that was where he first began to work with metal. He first got his hands on metal and made a few pieces back then, which we have some of those early pieces. Renee donated her gorgeous necklace. So he began to get acquainted with metal, and he really eventually became very bonded with metal. His whole life centered around working with metal, and he liked to call himself a metal worker. When people said, well, do you want to be known as an artist or a sculptor? And he said, I'm a metal worker. So, and he also went to the School for the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, got a scholarship there. And one of his teachers from Cass, Louise Green, recommended Harry for a scholarship here to Cranbrook. Now, Harry had never even seen Cranbrook, never heard of it. It was actually very new at the time, and he was a little worried and said, well, I'd like to at least see the place before I apply for this scholarship. And she said, No, I assure you, you just go there and you'll love it and it will all work out. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. He came to Cranbrook in 1937. At that time, Cranbrook was just a baby. They were not even accredited as a school. But you think of where was Detroit at that time? Well, the Ford factory, the automobile industry was huge. There was a lot of wealth. And okay, the Depression was happening, but Detroit at that time was really in its heyday. And Cranbrook became this incredible melting pot of creative spirits from all over the world, really. And it was a very free-flowing kind of place to study. You could study as much as you want or as little, take whatever classes. It was very open-ended, and this worked quite well for Harry. He enjoyed it. And it was also here at Cranbrook where he met some very influential people. We've got and of course it was his father, Elio, who was the director of Cranbrook at that time. And the Saarinen family basically adopted Florence Schust Knoll, who was an orphan, and she ended up spending a lot of time with the Saarinens. Eero Saarinen was the man who ultimately gave Harry his first commissioned sculpture job at the General Motors Center. That was in the 50s. And Florence Knoll, of course, was the one who hired Harry for the Knoll Company, and he designed the Bertoia collection for Knoll. We've got Charles and Ray Eames. They were both here at Cranbrook at that time. That's where they met and married. And it was Charles, we'll hear a little more about him later, but Charles Eames and Ray moved to California, and they invited Harry to come and work with them. And it was a little bit orchestrated because Harry had come to the United States through Canada and technically only had a visa for Canada. So it was discovered when the war started that he was an illegal alien, and they were about to kick him out. And his Cranbrook buddies came to his rescue, and Charles Eames hired him. And one of the criteria to stay in the country was if you were required to do work that no one else could do, you could stay. So that worked out quite nicely. And of course, we have Brigitte, who Greg mentioned. And Brigitte, I just have to honor Brigitte. Oh, okay. Great. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. All right. I just have to say a couple words about Brigitte because she was such a character. And Mom, I love you. But she was 19 when she moved to Detroit to live with her father, William Valentiner, who was the director there at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And she really didn't know where she was going in life, but her parents decided that, let's get her into the art world, let's get her educated. And because Valentiner was good friends with the Booth family, who were one of the founders of the academy here, it was quite simple to get her enrolled here at Cranbrook. And her mother, who was a little bit esoteric, her mother had done her horoscope and saw by the stars that she was supposed to meet her future husband before she turned 20, so when she was still 19. So she enrolled in the fall semester, and her birthday was at the end of September. So she started classes here, and she took a jewelry class from Harry. First day of class, she's looking him up and down, and she's thinking, ooh, that might be my man. So, so she managed to finagle getting to know him. In fact, she loved to tell the story of how in the cafeteria, in the lunch hall, the teachers, the instructors, would sit at the end of the table, and all the students would be along the sides, and she managed to sit right next to him, catty corner. And somehow she reached across and spilled his glass of milk all over his pants. So they got to talking, and one thing led to another, and they ended up married. But it was very important, him meeting Brigitte, because William Valentiner was just a huge figure in the art world at that time. And because he had grown up in Germany and was an art historian, he established his career in Germany. But he would travel back and forth to Europe, and he collected all this amazing art that was just totally different from anything the art world had ever seen. You know, we've got Paul Klee. In fact, this Paul Klee hung in our home when I was growing up for many, many years. And you know, we've got, this was just a whole new concept to Harry. He had grown up in Italy, where you see wonderful sculptures of naked people, but you don't see this kind of stuff. So he was introduced to a whole new realm, and these artists and others were very influential in his early development. I would say Cranbrook was the place where Harry developed as an artist. I mean, he learned some skills at Cass Technical High School, and he knew he wanted to be an artist, but it was really here at Cranbrook where he got the exposure and the experience and began to set his roots as an artist in his own right. So he came here in 1937 as a student of painting, but he soon realized that painting was two-dimensional, it was just too flat, and it wasn't enough. So Eliel Saarinen noticed some of the jewelry and the metal work that Harry was doing kind of on his own time. And there had been an agreement when they took him on as a scholarship student that eventually he would take over the metalsmithing shop. So in 1939, he indeed did that. It looked something like this. And he was so excited because there were all these tools he could use, and he just loved it. So when he was working with students, so he became part instructor and part student. So during class time, when he was working with the students, he was a very responsible man, and he would give them the attention they needed. But after hours, he would experiment. And that's when he started making all these incredible pieces that you see up there. So then it began. Now the thing with the jewelry too is that it was only made for a fairly short period of his career. It actually started at Cass Tech, but here at Cranbrook was the bulk of his jewelry making. And he made many gifts. This gold necklace was a necklace for my mother, for Brigitte. The napkin rings. He made a lot of practical things. This ring was made out of aluminum, of all things. He experimented with all different metals. He wanted to learn the qualities and characteristics of each metal, which of course, came in handy in his later career, too. Now, this is a brass bracelet, and I'll tell you a little story with this one, because it was just lovely. A woman who was getting up in years emailed me out of the blue, website contact. She said, I have a Bertoia bracelet. It was given to me, and I would love to give it back to the family. Okay, great. So we chatted more. It turns out that Richard Raceman, who was at one time the director of Cranbrook, back in Harry's day, his wife was gifted, Harry gifted her this bracelet. And she loved it. She wore it for many years. Then she moved away, and she met this woman who contacted me, who, when she was a youngster, she was getting ready herself to go and study at Cranbrook. So it seemed appropriate. She gave her the bracelet, so she wore it through her Cranbrook years. And then many years later, she gave it to me, and I said, well, can I give you something for it? And she said, no, this has been gifted through the ages, and I want to gift it back to the family. And this is the kind of thing, since we've started the foundation, the Harry Bertoia Foundation, things like this happen all the time. It's incredibly synchronistic, and Harry generated so much goodwill, and his generosity and his integrity, it keeps coming back and touching me on the cheek. It's just wonderful. Okay, this piece, which is actually in the exhibition, and I didn't know that when I decided to put this piece in my lecture, because this one has a story too. If you can see some letters there. This woman came to me, and she wasn't sure if it was a Bertoia. She thought it was, because there were some connections, but she came and said, I want your opinion on this. And as I looked at it and I saw those letters, I just couldn't quite figure it out. But then it started to dawn on me. Well, as World War II was approaching and metal was becoming very scarce because the government was taking all the metals for war purposes. Well, Harry would go to flea markets and garage sales and scrounge around and pick up whatever metal objects were there, silverware. So we finally figured out he must have just picked up some silverware that had the SS for sterling silver, and he didn't bother to sand out the letters and just used it to make a brooch. So that's kind of fun. Now this, you can see the similarity, Brancusi's bird in space and Harry Bertoia's copper vase. Now I heard, it's just great the way all these stories come to me. I was talking to a gentleman named Ken Dukoff, and he told me that when Harry was here at Cranbrook, he was often invited into some of the neighboring households, and there were a lot of wealthy people back then. And it was at one of these households, now Ken wasn't sure which one, perhaps the Booths or whoever, but there was Brancusi's bird in space. And again, this was a very influential time for Harry. So he's looking at this bird in space. He loved the nice, sleek lines. And obviously that was a big influence. He made this copper vase. So again, Cranbrook was just such a time of development and maturity for him. Now you can see too how the jewelry here was one step toward the rest of his career. And we see how the gold brooch with the energy radiating out, and it's got a similar kind of energy to the dandelions, which came much later. And this style of, I call it fishbone brooch with the moving arms. And then you've got the willow, which also had moving branches. And you can see this if you look at his sculpture and the jewelry, you see the crossover. Here's some more examples of that. Now, especially these, and there's several examples up in the exhibition, these very light, airy wire pieces. And his first sculptures were quite similar. Wire, a simple material, and that was the first step. That was his first foray into sculpture, was wire. You can see the little creatures on that brooch, and that later led to this kind of landscape. Now this brooch, or pendant, and this, they were both made in the 1970s. Most of his jewelry, as I was mentioning, was made here at Cranbrook between the years of 1937 and when he left in 1943. But he did make some jewelry in California. He was in California for about 7 years. And then once he moved to Pennsylvania to work at Knoll, that was pretty much the end of his jewelry making. There were occasions where he would make a special piece for a special lady in his life. And at the very end of his life, he actually made a number of gong-like pendants like this. And that was a cool thing too. When I started taking on the task of furthering the legacy of Harry Bertoia, it was rather daunting. It still is, but so much fun. And one of the things I wanted to do was to make some limited editions of his jewelry. So I began to proceed finding a jeweler and checking out materials and so on. So I went ahead and did this project, and it was only later, it was several years later, as I was researching for the book that I wrote, that I found these letters between Harry and his gallery friend in Oslo, Norway, Kara Bernsten. They had been discussing a jewelry project, and Kara wanted Harry to make a whole series of jewelry that they would reproduce in a limited edition. And when I read those letters, I was just thrilled, because to me that was confirmation that I was on the right track, and that's what Harry would have wanted. Now this piece, which is up there too, I think is just the culmination of Harry's jewelry career. It is just so stunning, and I don't know if this will ever happen, but I hope that perhaps the docents can come around and demonstrate how it moves. It is hinged, and it's alive. I mean, the thing is amazing. It's gorgeous to look at, but then when you see that it moves, it's just... And a piece like this, I mean, what do you do with this? Obviously, a woman's not going to wear it as a breastplate. It's a little too big. But it's just so frivolous and joyful and wonderful. And I think that Harry's years here at Cranbrook were very joyful and just a fantastic time for him. And it's epitomized in this piece. Now, Harry was very much influenced by nature, and you can see the resemblance here, the spider webs and the, oops, This one is simply cotton thread. And I'm told that he did these freehand, which you look at it, it looks so perfect. But Harry was a perfectionist, so it's just pretty astonishing. And this one, although it is metal, it too looks like a spider web. Now these are some of the later pieces. This copper bracelet made in 1945, so by that time he was in California, and that bracelet is made with one continuous wire of copper. And again, how he was able to be so precise. And Harry's hands, I should have put a picture of his hands, because he had these farmer hands. I mean, if you've ever seen the statue of David in Firenze, and the hands are big. And that's what Harry's hands were like, really. They were these big, stocky hands, and you just can hardly even imagine how he made such delicate, precise pieces. Now, these later pieces were in the 70s. They were just experiments. I think they were part of what the Oslo gallery dealer was encouraging him to experiment with. Again, you can see the relationship of the early jewelry. This piece was way early on, and it just relates to these gongs that were from the 1970s when he was exploring the sonambient pieces. Now, this pendant, the reproduction I'm wearing, that was much later. That was made in the 70s, and he was making big gongs just like it. Okay, so we've touched on the jewelry. I also want to introduce you to some of his other works, and luckily we do have some monotypes up in the exhibition as well. And that was an activity that Harry continued throughout his life, but it again started here at Cranbrook. It was as if his time at Cranbrook was the basis of everything that came later. And in some of these monotypes, and there are thousands of them, there's about 1,000 monotypes that are still with the family, but we have estimated that there are probably about 4,000 monotypes. And Cranbrook has a lovely selection here. But if you look at the monotypes, the whole progression of them, you can see all of his sculptures, all of the jewelry, all of everything happened on paper first. And now this style was made with simple wooden blocks, dipping it into the ink and then stamping it on the paper, the textured paper. He liked paper that had a little life to it. Now this kind of monoprint was done a little bit differently, where he would spread the ink out on the surface, then take the paper and put it there, and from the back side, using tools and his fingers, would make the design. And because the paper was in the way of the actual design, he couldn't really see what he was designing with his physical eyes. And he said it necessitated inner vision, which he enjoyed, because Harry's goal was to take the creative juices that came to him and just get them out into his work. And that was why Harry early on he would sign some of his pieces, but starting in Cranbrook and thereafter, Harry Bertoia never signed his pieces, and it was because of his philosophy that His creativity came from a higher source, came from a divine place, and that it happened to come out of his hands. He didn't want to claim that just for one man. He had a bit of an Eastern philosophy in that he wanted it to be enjoyed just as art. So these are some of the tools that he would use with the monotypes. Now the monotypes, again, he really went wild with them here at Cranbrook, but they continued throughout his life. But it was here at Cranbrook where I think the monotypes have just such a wonderful quality, and they're really art in themselves. Later on, they became more of a planning tool for the sculptures that he was making. But you can see he would use dog brushes, and well, these are the brayers. He would roll the ink out, and just, pencils, just anything to get the effects that he wanted. So then the next step came, which was moving, this chair. Now this happened at Cranbrook too. I'm telling you, Cranbrook was just a really big step in Harry Bertoia's career. This chair was the winner of the Museum of Modern Art's competition for organic furniture design in the chair division. This was a combination effort by Charlie Eames and Eero Saarinen. But because Cranbrook was so small, really the classes were maybe eight or 10 students, and it wasn't as if you had to sit at the table and it was all formal. It was a very free-flowing operation. Harry's jewelry studio was not too far from Charlie Eames's office, so they'd be in and out of each other's offices and just checking out what the other people were doing. So Harry would come in when they were working on these chair designs and throw out his ideas and learning from them. So this chair won the competition, and the result of the competition was that MoMA would help to sponsor the manufacturing of the winning chair. So at that point, Charles and Ray Eames moved to California and invited Harry. That's when they hired him so he wouldn't get deported. And this chair was the eventual result. Now this molded plywood Eames chair, there's a lot of history about this too. You'll have to read the book for the whole thing, but just to give a little bit of background, molded plywood was a brand new material at that time. So we're talking mid-1940s here. And molded plywood, they didn't quite have it all dialed in yet. So to make plywood bend and curve was quite challenging. In fact, with this chair, they really didn't intend to have that hole in the back, but because the wood was buckling and cracking, they had to make a hole. And the original intention was not to have this chair upholstered. But again, because the wood just looked awful, it was all blemished and wrinkled, they put on the material to cover up the blemishes. Because molded plywood was not an easy material to work with. So Harry and this whole Eames menagerie were trying to come up with a chair that could be easily mass-produced. And Harry had some of the models of the MoMA chair, and he said, well, look, you've got to cut it in half. They had little table-sized models, and Harry said, yeah, you've got to separate this part from this part. So he took one of Charles' models that's out in California now, and he just sliced it in half. Well, Charles was a little upset that he took his precious model. But indeed, that worked. It worked because you didn't have so many compound curves in the plywood. And the metal framework, well, that was Harry's idea as well, because he was a metals man. They had to hold the pieces of wood together somehow, so Harry came up with that. And the whole idea that Charles Eames had put out was that this was a team effort. There were about 10 of them all working together, trying to figure out this mass production of a chair. And it was said that everyone would get full credit for their piece in the design. Well, when the chair came out, it was known as the Eames chair. So artists and their egos, Harry wasn't too happy about that. So at that point, he moved on. Well, so then the next step was the connection with Knowles. And now you have to imagine, okay, now we're up to about 1950, and the design community was close-knit, and especially all the people who were here at Cranbrook. They were all buddies and really lifelong friends. They ended up being, most of them. Now, okay, they didn't have Instagram and Facebook, but they stayed connected. They had postcards and occasional phone calls. Well, Hans and Florence Knoll, starting their company in Pennsylvania, they heard that Harry had left Eames somewhat disgruntled. And Florence was just a remarkable woman. To study her life is just amazing. But she was a real mover and shaker, and she had the idea, you know, I'm going to go snatch up that Harry Bertoia. We need him over here. So she did. She went out to visit all of them in California, and ultimately she invited Harry to come and work for them in Pennsylvania. Now, this was kind of a fun story, too. Now, someone's going to have to tell me if I'm going too long here, because I could tell you stories all night. But this is a great one about Brigitta, because when they were deciding whether or not to move to Pennsylvania to go and work with the Knowles, they had the invitation, the letter. It was sitting on the kitchen table, and Harry was a very grounded, rooted man. He didn't make decisions quickly. He would ponder and think, and a very deliberate man. Now, Brigitta, on the other hand, was quick and light and a party girl and adventurer. So she saw that letter sitting on the kitchen table for days, weeks, months. And Harry wasn't making a decision. And finally, she took it upon herself to write to Hans Knoll and said, yes, we're coming, we've decided, we'll be there. Well, so Harry gets a postcard shortly thereafter from Hans. Oh, Harry, we're so excited to have you come. Congratulations, wonderful. And Harry goes home and says to Brigitta, what's this? I didn't think I made a decision. And she just offhandedly says, oh, I told them we were coming and I forgot to tell you. So, of course, it worked out very well, because then we had the whole Bertoia collection for Knoll, which, now you think about this too. These chairs first came out in 1952, and they have been in continuous production till now. I mean, they're some of Knoll's best sellers to this day. So we're talking a timeless design here, just a classic. They were modern back then. They still look modern. Now that's when I was still cute. And the asymmetric chase lounge is a really great story too. I won't go into all the details, but back in the 50s, I'll just give you a taste of it. Back in the 50s, it was simply too complex to mass produce this asymmetric chase lounge because of all the different curves and angles. So Noel put the sketches on the back burner and sort of forgot about it. Well, my sister, Lesta, on the right there, she married Al, and as marriages go, it didn't quite work out. So they divorced, and she left a lot of things with Al, including a prototype of the asymmetric chase lounge. Well, this prototype went to Wright auction in 2004, and by golly, it turned some heads, and it sold for $118,000. Well, Noel, of course, took note of this. They didn't have the budget to purchase the prototype, but the head honcho of Noel called up Richard Wright, who's a great guy, and said, hey, we'd like to get the measurements and the specifications on this prototype. Can we send somebody over? And he says, yep, sure, you've got 24 hours. So they did send over a man, this Dave Brandenberger, and he and a helper furiously were measuring and photographing this prototype, and what they had to do was they took just a plumb bob, a string with a weight on it, and they would take at each of the wire intersections, they'd take that and measure the distance from the floor. So they did that at every intersection. I mean, you're talking a lot of measurements, but somehow they managed to get it all together, and they began mass producing the chair. They introduced it at the Milan Furniture Fair, a huge furniture event in the world, in 2005. And people loved it so much that the first year's production sold out right there at the fair. Now this is just a family picture in the late 1950s. We lived out in the country. Harry was very influenced by nature, and we lived smack in the middle of nature. We had 200 acres, virgin forests. It was wonderful. And what we would do as a family, I mean, occasionally we'd go to the movies or out to dinner, but really our family activities were things like laying on the summer lawn and looking at the stars, or simply taking a walk on the dirt road. It was very nature-based. And Harry was such a workaholic, he wasn't home all that much. But when he was home, he was very present. I never questioned his love for me. I felt very connected to him. Again, you can see the connection with nature, the dandelion weed in nature, and then the monotype, and then the ultimate three-dimensional dandelion. This one doesn't really need words. I think what Harry was able to do was he didn't try to copy or replicate nature, but somehow he was able to capture the essence and then put it into his work, made his own interpretation. Just another example, the red rocks down in the southwest, and then a spill cast sculpture. The bulk of Harry's career was doing these monumental sculptures. You know, the jewelry, as instrumental and important as it was in Harry's development, it was very unimportant in his total career. I mean, it was an important development step, but it was really this kind of monumental sculpture that affected the world in a bigger way. This piece was rather similar to the first one that Eero Saarinen hired him for at the General Motors Center. And this was great. Back in 1954, was put in this Manhattan Chase Bank. And the building, Gordon Bunshaft was the architect, and it was a lot of glass walls, which was pretty modern and different. And the bank, the year after this new building went up and they had the Harry Bertoia sculpture, apparently the deposits increased 20-fold. And then to finish the story in modern times, the building changed hands several times, and then it was being renovated. So in 2010, they removed the sculpture. And if any of you keep tabs on New York, the people just had a fit. They wanted their Bertoia back. It had become an icon of New York City. There were blogs and letters to the editor and just a hubbub, and there was actually a court case because the building had been declared a National Historic Site. Well, long story short, they brought it back. It's now in the Joe Fresh store, and there's a wonderful video, 10-minute video, if you ever want to see the whole story. Look up Joe Fresh Bertoia, really kind of fun. This, I think, is one of my father's most stunning sculptures. And again, very early on, 1955, he was just barely into his sculptural career. But you can see the detail. It simply taut wires with little pieces of metal. It's very simple. But you look at that, and you have to see it in person. It's in a chapel built or designed by Eero Saarinen, his old Cranbrook buddy, once again. And it's a non-denominational chapel on the campus of MIT. But you walk into that space, and you feel holy. It's a sacred space that he somehow created. Now, there was just one skylight, one window in the whole place. The light would come down and reflect on these little pieces of metal. Just so simple, but so amazing. And I think it speaks of this piece that Eero Saarinen's memorial service was held in this chapel. Just a sampling of his Bush-style sculptures. Harry did not do things in a hurry. You can see with the jewelry, the detail and the care that he took. Well, these bushes, especially a large one like this, which might have been 3 or 4 feet high, that took about 6 months to make. He was not in a hurry. His goal was to translate his vision into 3-dimensional manifestation. If he had to invent a new technique, no problem. If it took a long time, no worries. Impossible was not a word that he used. I just love that picture of us just walking down the road. My mom took the picture. And my siblings tell me that I was the favorite child. I don't know if that's true, but I definitely felt a connection with him. We're both a bit stubborn and focused and directed. I don't have the creative spirit that he had. My bent is more organizational, but we were definitely kindred spirits. I talk to him all the time. Just some examples of his sounding sculptures, which again, we're focused on the jewelry, but this is one of the huge pieces that Harry was known for, the toning sculptures. And ultimately, he put about 100 of these sounding sculptures in the remodeled barn that we had on our property. And I have to confess, as a high school student, when I was in high school, my girlfriends and I would go in this barn and just touch all of them and kind of go crazy in there. It was pretty fun. But drawing to a close here. Now, this one I like because, all right, here's Harry's 2-rod tonal, which he installed before he died. And it was only later that these 2 trees grew right behind it. And we like to think that perhaps nature was inspired by Harry. And unfortunately, because of all his welding, and he never wanted to use a mask. People would say, Harry, all those fumes, you got to protect yourself. Well, he didn't want that interference between his work and his psyche. So he contracted lung cancer, and he actually had a chance to heal himself. My sister took him to a retreat healing center in Mexico, and they said, yeah, look, if we'll put you on this organic diet, this is back in the 70s, and it would take a few years, but we could heal you. And he wouldn't have been able to work. He was so weak at that point, and he said, I've lived a good life. My kids will carry on from here. I'm not going to put Brigitte through that, trying to make smoothies for me 5 times a day. So he made the choice to die at age 63. This is where we buried him on the property. That's a 10-foot diameter gong. There's the cat. You can get a sense. And we thought it was appropriate. It was a gong that he had installed a few years earlier, but we put him right under there, and we think he would have liked that. So I'm happy to answer questions, and again, I thank you.